Thank you for doing this. I'm a great fan of the Architecture Foundation in general, and I'm glad to do this tonight. I thought what I'd do is read a kind of short general statement about cities in the pandemic, and then show you some images about how density relates to it. And I'm on secondment from the LSE to the UN, working on problems of cities and climate change. And as you'll see in the images I'm going to show you, the problems of the pandemic and the problems of climate change sort of intersect and issues of density. And then I hope we can have some kind of discussion. I loathe high tech, so and I'm very bad at it. So I hope this all works out. But I'll start by reading something just rather general about cities in the pandemic. In Homo Sacer, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben writes of the repression which occurs when a state of exception exists. People's lives are reduced to a biological minimum, as in the Nazi concentration camps. But this reduction can persist once the exceptional conditions pass. The sociologist Alain Touraine long ago showed how wartime conditions legitimated state regulation of people's lives long after the Second World War ended. Power structures, that is to say, exploit crises and use them to legitimate expanded control. Now, panic, in my view, allows this exploitation to take place. Few younger people in rich countries today have the experience of military discipline, whose guiding principle was, for us, that soldiers keep their head under fire. Panic in a war zone almost entirely guarantees getting killed. But the media today are drunk on panic, representing the extremes of illness and death as an inevitable fate. When good news appears, as in the German diminution of the disease, it is no longer equal in the media to the excitement of comparing the pandemic to the Black Death in the 14th century. Absurd, but the comparison excites. And it's in this way that media power serves the normalizing project. I'm not at all minimizing the present pandemic, just saying that it has to be addressed without panicking, and that it presents an opportunity, if that's the right word, both for exploitation and for thinking about a different society. This is just the prospect cities face today. Rules of control over cities will outlast the pandemic. In particular, rules regulating public space, dictating social distance, dispersing crowds, will persist even after we have the medical means to suppress the disease. We have a near historic reminder, at least Americans do. After 9/11, regulation restricting public gatherings, controlling access to buildings, and specifying how bomb-proof buildings should be constructed stayed in the statute books. Social distancing, which is necessary during the crisis, threatens similarly to become a norm as it was after 9/11, enforced by the government. And I say this is true now, even after people, thanks to an effective vaccine, no longer have a compelling reason to fear proximity to others. The pandemic challenges us to think about issues in the city, however, which will outlast it. The first of these is social isolation, the grim cousin of social distancing. The pandemic, particularly in Europe, I'm speaking from London, has raised in people's minds the problem of how to deal with the large number of elderly people living alone. In London, 40% of the elderly live alone. And in Paris, it's a staggering 68%. They are already experiencing social distancing. Loneliness does nothing positive for either their physical or their mental health. Governments, in my judgment, are incapable of writing laws which overcome the emotional loneliness which the imposition of social distancing creates. This is a challenge instead for urban civil society, and particularly, I think, for architecture, one for which we are going to need new concepts about community and how to build it physically. The pandemic, in particular, challenges urbanists to rethink the architecture of density. Density is a rationale for cities. Concentration of activities in the city stimulates activity, e.g., for instance, the so-called agglomeration effect. Concentration of people is also a good ecological principle in dealing with climate change by saving on ecological resources. I'll come back to that in a bit. It is also a good thing socially, people being exposed to others unlike themselves in a densely diverse city. Yet to prohibit or prevent future pandemics, we may need to find different physical forms for density without enacting social distancing. Physical forms which permit people to communicate, to see neighbors, to participate in street life, even though they are physically and temporarily separate. Now, and I'll show you this in a bit, Chinese urbanists long ago found such a flexible form in the Shukuman courtyard. And we architects and planners need to find its contemporary equivalent. A more challenging issue for density is transport. The benefits of public transport consist of efficiently massing numbers of riders together, but that isn't a healthy form of densification. Thus, planners in Paris or in Bogota are exploring so-called 15-minute cities in which people can walk or cycle to dense nodes in the city rather than travel mechanically to a dense center. But it would require an economic revolution to bring this about, especially in developing cities in which factories are located, as in Bogota, very far from the barrios and informal settlements where workers live. That is to say, pedestrianization it's a form of privilege. It doesn't mean anything in a place where even by car you have to travel for an hour and a half or 2 hours to get to your job. You can't walk there or cycle there and have a job if you're poor. This flags up a big issue: how to reconcile and integrate the healthy city with the green city. There are some obvious small grain meeting points, such as figuring out ways the poor do not have to burn garbage and so contribute to pollution. But the larger relation between healthy and green requires us to do a radical rethink about density. I should say in this regard that the pandemic is, in my view, a kind of natural experiment in class inequality. Work which people can do at home is largely middle-class labor, whereas you cannot collect garbage, do plumbing or other manual services online. If the current pandemic leaves a lasting trace in the world of work, I fear it will be one of widening gap between mental and manual labor, with the working class more likely to be exposed to potentially unhealthy conditions. That said, the pandemic might, on the other hand, humanize the use of technology in cities. The smart city models of a generation ago were all about regulation and control. It was the state online. What's emerging in this pandemic, however, are good programs and protocols which help create community. I'm particularly impressed in London by the number of mutual care networks which are springing up in communities like mine. I live in Clerkenwell, which is a very diverse area, but it hasn't had much of a community until now. In sum, this is a time to fear the opportunity pandemic offers the ruling powers, to reject the theater of pandemic staged in the media, to find ways to counter the widening gap between a safe middle class and an exposed working class, to explore instead forms of density which could relate the green city and the healthy city, and to use technology to affirm the power of community in the city. That's sort of in general how I'm thinking about this problem today. I don't know whether I'll feel that tomorrow, and I'll have to rewrite this whole overview. But what I want to share with you now is some particular ideas about how we as architects and planners might get into the issue of density.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what I'm going to show you, as I said, I'm seconded to the UN to work on issues of density and climate change. And for us, this is a modal scene of a place where poor people are living in a dense way, which has reduced pollution in Delhi, which is, as you know, overwhelming at times. This is Nehru Place. What you're looking at is actually the top of a parking garage, the roof of a underground parking garage. On the plain here is a very mixed set of open markets, but it's particularly a market in gray goods electronics, that is in iPhones which fell off the back of a truck. And you can buy, as with my iPhone, I don't think you can see this, you can buy them very cheaply here. It's an entry level for people to get into the, as in all informal markets, to get into the business of selling. And as you can see from this image, it's mixed with people buying saris and so on. What the image doesn't show clearly is what's happening inside the building on the side. That was formerly a government office. It's now divided up into little rooms as a set of startups. This is Delhi's Silicon Alley, if you like. And it's a dense, diverse place in which the economy has flourished. It's included poor people, but from the health point of view, it's a nightmare. Let me show you, we're also working in the Drazi Slump. I don't like the term slum. It's an informal settlement. This is a place where the food that's cooked for lunches throughout Mumbai is prepared. It's also a place of primary industrial work, because on the ground floor of many of these buildings, people make baskets and other kinds of woven materials, and they live above. Again, it's a place that, from the ecological point of view, since they just go downstairs to commute to work, is good. And this is, again, in Mumbai, a very polluted city. This is a relatively less polluted place, but it's a nightmare from the point of view of health. I'll show you a third slide, which is what Shanghai still looks like in large parts. And this is one of the reasons that China had an epidemic, because people are living out in the open in conditions which are not very sanitary to begin with. During the week, this is a wet market. Hello?
Hello, that's fine.
Okay, this is a wet market during the week, and you can understand it. Here has been the solution. The historical solution for a healthy city is Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin. It's a vertical city in which people live up in these 18-story towers. The ground plane is only given over to traffic. All the public space, to the extent there is public space, are raised parks. But basically, in these cruciform buildings, people are removed. They're given light and air, and they're removed from the kind of horrific conditions, the Paris equivalent of something like this. You could find this version of life all through the faubourg of Paris at the time Corbusier wrote. So that was the plan, to make a city which was both green and healthy, saving of resources, providing a way of people to live healthily as well. Here's the reality of it. This is one of the students of Corbusier, I'm not going to name him, but you know who it is, who built a version of the Plan Voisin in de Ravi to get rid of this condition. And this is a place in which levels of mental distress, drug taking, teenage crime, and so on have soared. It's a space of social distancing. And social distancing has brought loneliness to the poor, and also a kind of disorganization to the lives of young people. Here's a Chinese version of the same thing, same version of Corbusier. This is housing. I'm sorry to say that when I earlier worked for the UN, I was involved with the World Bank at financing this. That's my crime. But you can see here, again, a kind of building. This is for one-child families, in which isolation is the name of the game. And as in India, as in Mumbai, it's a place with a lot of social disorganization, dealt with here only by the very draconian hand of the Chinese Communist Party, but it's suppressed rather than eliminated. So the question is, how can we think about a density which might be different? One of the things we're looking at is, this is, I'm going to show you two models here that Richard Burdett and our team at the London School of Economics built for the Venice Biennale. This is what density looks like in London, and this is what it looks like in New York. And one of the things that, it's not just because we all live in London, although we're all foreigners, that we prefer this model, but that this kind of flattened density seems more amenable to the kinds of healthy experiences than this in New York, as we're seeing now. The areas here, I'm going to see if this, ooh, isn't that wonderful? Can you say this thing move?
Yep.
Oh, great. A cursor, isn't that these areas here in the center of New York, this is Manhattan, are the actual epicenter of infection. It's here, this is the west side of Manhattan, and here, which is the Bronx, which is an extremely dense part of New York. So the idea to us is, how can we do that kind of flattening density? What will we do? Now, in our shop, what we're focusing on for the UN is housing, not public space. And I'm going to show you 3 models of what might be done. As something to discuss. Hold on, somebody will get that phone. There it is. This is the same density on the same square footage or square meterage. It holds the same number of people in 3 different kinds of housing forms. The first up here, isn't this wonderful? The first up here is a Corbusier model. That's the tower in the park, which enacts isolation of a form, save when people take the elevator down here, but at a huge sociological price. This is a low-rise form of density, typical to most London streets. And it's more ecologically sound, but there is less sociable space in them. If you have this, as we know endlessly in London's working class suburbs, this kind of morphology, you don't have much meeting point outside the house. It is healthier, but it's not more social in public. The morphology we're exploring is one that is a modern version of the shikuman. The shikuman was a courtyard whose components could be built and rebuilt over the course of time easily. My team is exploring how we could use these modular courtyard components so that the people who are most at risk can be further away from dense center, but still related to it. For instance, this is housing for the elderly, which is on the top. It is serviced by an elevator, but here, for instance, could be a store or a health clinic below it. The thing about this is that you can reconfigure this so that you get agglomeration effects economically, but also you get mixture of differences socially. Even if it were people all of the same race or even of the same gender, but of different ages, this would work as a viable form of dwelling. It's very porous, as you can see, a viable form of dwelling, which also is configurable and reconfigurable during times of panic so that people can inhabit different parts of it, which you can't do here or here. So this is what we're exploring now. It's, again, the same problem as in the barrio. To make modular forms of courtyard dwelling is something that requires a lot of money. And we're trying to figure out how to make this cheaper. I don't say this is a solution to the problem of resolving green and healthy, but it's a particular thing I'm involved in, and my team is involved in at the UN in exploring now. How far can we go to make a kind of modular city that has a kind of flexibility that makes it more sustainable, either when it's attacked by a pandemic or in the face of climate change, when there are extremes of weather and things like that. So that's really what I want to put on the table for you. And I thought we just might discuss it. I don't know how you run a discussion on this, but that's what's on my mind.
That's fantastic. Okay, we have you back full screen, Richard.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Can I mean, maybe I think the way we're going to run this is if people have questions, could they put them in the chat box on the right-hand side? I'll keep an eye out for them, and then I'll call you out to give you a question to Richard. I'll unmute you and see how successful that is. So yeah, please type away in the chat box, and we'll open it out. But Richard, could I perhaps begin by, I was fascinated really by this you referred to the extent to which transport is such a fundamental issue here in terms of the current problems that we're facing. And obviously from a London perspective, you and I both in London, we're undergoing a huge amount of densification in the periphery of the city at the moment. But a lot of that densification is directed at delivering housing units exclusively. We're seeing transport interchanges around the periphery become high density housing hubs. They're not places where you can walk within 15 minutes to your place of work or place of education. I mean, in a way, of course, London, the history of London is a history of series of villages which have coagulated over time.
Right,
and
right. That's why it's got that flatter profile compared to New York, right? Because
how do we politically, how do we argue for the return to that sort of polycentric model of London, rather than what we seem to be building at the moment, which is an arrangement which puts ever greater pressure on transport infrastructure into the center of town, and at moments like the present crisis, becomes simply untenable.
Right. Well, I think there are two questions there. One, which is an infrastructure question of its own, and the other is the relation of the infrastructure to the political. And about the infrastructure question of its own, I loathe Boris Buses because what they do is essentially increase the capacity of something not known about them. They increase capacity on the bus, whereas what we should be doing is making smaller minibuses. And if we were to do that, to have more smaller minibuses, it would be possible within the bus itself to reduce densities. The last thing we should be doing is building more subway lines, more metro underground lines. That's a terrible way to get people to work. I'm also a fan of trams, which are another relatively easily made, low-cost way in tram cars of getting large numbers of people around. So I think we need a different kind of infrastructure model in which we have more of smaller units of infrastructure and no more tube. That's my view. To do that, the political changes that are required to do that kind of building are to give the boroughs more power. London is a remarkable, it's decentralized physically, but power the city doesn't have much power, nor do really the boroughs. That's all held by central government. And I think to do anything about transport, we've got to radically decentralize it. I'd like to see bus lines owned by councils, for instance, at that level. Then you get a finer grain of control and maybe more, and maybe a better quality of service. But I mean, that's a great paradox of London, that it has very weak cities, very centralized systems of national power over cities, and yet the cities themselves are very low density compared to other places, which have more power. Paris has more power over its fortunes than London, far more power.
Richard, we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm gonna open it out. Nico McDonald, I've unmuted you if you want to pitch yours.
Yeah, the lovely lecture, Richard. I'm wondering if we're being too responsive to the crisis. I mean, maybe obviously your thinking is bigger than this, but we only have pandemics in the developed world at least every century at this rate. And should we be redesigning cities based on a centenarian event?
That's really an interesting question. No, I mean, it makes sense. And even the terms of the pandemic are in this kind of panic mode, BBC panic, mode, which is that I'm not a statistician, but according to our statisticians at the LSE, what we're failing to do is distinguish between excess deaths and the people who would have died anyhow. Those numbers all look much lower. But I mean, there is a general issue about this. I think given what's happened now, people want in some way to know that cities are healthier. And there are aspects of health which don't relate to pandemics, which are really important. London is incredibly polluted, It doesn't have people burning garbage because there is no garbage collection, but it has lots of unhealthy conditions. And so I think that, I don't know, I am really sensible to what you say, but I think it's worth thinking about the relation of health to ecology, even if this is a wild exaggeration of where we're at.
Thank you.
Next up, Katie Fisher, please.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for your really interesting talk. I just thought.
Where are you?
I'm in the suburbs. I've struck gold, and actually, that kind of really brings me to my question because in this current climate, it seems to be like a real value in having private outdoor space, and I think people are finding several parks are sort of closed or overcrowded,
right.
And this is almost a deterrent for people wanting to spend time or feel like they're able to spend time in these spaces. And so although in sort of more normal times, the third option that you showed in terms of density seems like fantastic, but in these times, in terms of mental health and community, that being said, sort of how much do you think that open space should be integrated within the density and health discussion?
Well, but it's really, it's a sociological question, and it has to do about how people use the public space. If a few people use it in a way which is obviously not healthy, you're just inviting the authorities to do those kinds of seizures I was talking about, to extend their reach. I'm told by friends in Berlin that all the parks are open, and people, they're good Germans, they social distance, they've been told to do it. The state is in their body, and they do it, and they're able to use public space. Here, there's a kind of in your face among some people, which is an invitation to power. So I think this is really it's a question of a sociable question. It shouldn't be a question for regulation by the authorities. Now I know that's very Mickey Mouse and idealistic, but the alternative is policemen threatening to put you in jail if you sunbathe, And that's absurd, you know. I thought you were going to ask me about whether suburbs are the answer to this.
No, I
And
suppose.
they might be an answer to fresh air and so on, but they're such a bad answer to green issues, you know, about getting, you know, their energy inefficient, you know. They require people to drive, you know. You can't bicycle, you can't walk, and most people in suburbs either take very packed tubes or they drive in. So I don't think it's the answer. I think we need to find forms of density which they're not a solution, but they're towards a solution of something that gets the benefits of density that are real in terms of climate change. You know, they are real benefits. Your suburb looks beautiful, however. Is that all your backyard? No.
I've gone to my parents, so yeah. They've got a bit more space.
Next up, we have Maria Gliona. Maria, oh, sorry. Are you there?
Hello. Yes, I'm here. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. And I have one question that regards your model, the model that you've shown. And I was wondering how much this model takes into consideration the amount of private space. So in a way, the ratio between, you know, the private space per person. And if it's becoming, I mean, I live in a house with like 5 friends, and my family lives in Italy, and it's many of them, it's 5 of them in the house as well. And I think it's becoming very clear that this model of living, which is very much against what they advertise these days, it works a lot better rather than the single occupancy flat, which is something that we have here. And I think, especially in these times of isolation, can have a much bigger effect on the way people live and how healthy they are. And I was wondering how much your model takes into consideration also the private space that is allowed per person, and if that changes in any way.
This is a really good question, and it's one that part of my team is trying to research, which is how, if you have a modular form, you know, even going back to the old Moshe Safdie, remember those concrete blocks that you put in, but with a newer kind of modular form that's more, that's not so rigid and fixed. How you can put together so you can reconfigure flats. Now we originally got into this for something that has to do with something that went wrong in China, which is that at a certain point, the Chinese realized that the one-child policy would mean that in a few decades, there were more elderly people than there were workers. So they then pursued a multi-child policy. And that pursuit meant that a lot of the buildings that they'd put up, like the one that I, to my shame, was involved in, that those projects really had to be torn down. They were impossible to retrofit. So what we're looking at now is how you can reconfigure these cubes, which I think will probably be made out of recycled plastic if we ever get to the demonstrations stage. There'll probably be recycled plastic and other garbage. How you can configure those so that as a family changes over time, you can add or subtract units to it. There is an issue about modularity, which on the other side of this, which is important, which is the provision of private space, which is not isolated space. You know, one of the things that we've been looking into is how to give parents who have small children private space so that they're not always in the presence of screaming 4 or 5-year-olds. That's a really important issue. And usually that was a product of luxury, that kind of adult space was a product of luxury housing. We're looking at how you can provide it within the context of these interconnected modules. But it is, in other words, the notion of joining everything up has a downside, which is that people lose any private space. And so it's a balance between the two. And I think this, that's what I'm so interested in about these shikumen, that they were very flexible structures in time. You know, they changed from decade to decade. If the fortunes of this courtyard went up, they changed, the parts of it got bigger. If in times of famine or of war, they shrunk and so on. So that's what interests me about that model, that it breathes with people's experience.
Next up we have, I don't know a surname, but it's Lionel. Are you there?
Hi there.
Lionel?
Hi there.
Hello.
Yes. Thanks for the presentation, Richard. I had a question about the model again. So the three examples that you showed are all ballpark 75 dwellings per hectare, which in itself is denser than a suburb, but not necessarily anywhere near as dense as contemporary developments that you get in cities like London, in inner parts of the city. So my question is whether your research has indicated an optimum level of density where you think that there's a very good balance between the healthiness of the proposal, the sustainability of it, and other issues like the quantity of private to public space, etc.
It's a really good question. I mean, we took 75 as a kind of middle ground, you know, as a middle target. Let me ask you this question. Do you think if this were 150, that the modularity would it then become like a perimeter, would it have to become like a standard perimeter housing, or could you still keep the modularity if you doubled it?
I think you could keep the same concept. It might all have to be raised on a podium and you could still have that courtyard. I mean, this question is quite pertinent for me because I'm an architect. I work on master planning projects, and this is exactly the challenge that we face, that we're being asked to deliver housing projects ballpark in the region of, you know, upwards of 200 dwellings per hectare.
Yeah, that's impossible.
Yeah. And so what you find is you're aiming for perimeter blocks, but what you end up doing is podia with towers on top.
Yeah.
And
that like Canada Water would be an example of that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, an example. There are good high density, low rise examples in London, Bromley by Bow, which is a housing scheme. That's not raised, but they're few and far between.
Right, right.
So
you know, I think this raises another question, which is that the tower was the emblematic, was the emblem of modernity in the 20th century. And maybe it's an emblem of something else now, of appropriation, capitalist domination, and so on. But it's not modern because it's not something that is dealing with the conditions that we have to deal with, which are, you know, these exceptional stresses. And let me just say one other thing about that. One of the glories of the original Plan Voisin was the notion that all the windows opened. That is, it wasn't a sealed glass box. When you get up to 30 stories or 40 stories or the monsters in New York, that ends. And then you become reliant on mechanical systems for the building's breathing life. One of the projections we've done about what's going to happen in the New York City grid is that as the power grid, which is that as the temperature rises in New York City, the grid is going to fail the way it's failed on the West Coast in San Francisco, because the demands for energy in towers are so great, and those super talls are so great, that the grid as it now exists can't provide them. So they're self-destructive objects.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, the holy grail of this is how to get lower and, as it were, less dependent on mechanical systems for a lot of the healthy aspects of buildings. I think Corp got it just right. It's about 18 stories. You can still open a window on an 18th story and not be subject to wind pressures and so on. You can't, unfortunately, walk up and down 18 stories unless you're your age, not mine. But it's better than what we have now. And in terms of health, the issue, well, we're finding again, we just launched this study in New York, the elevator in a New York City apartment house is the site of incredible potential infection. You can't hose down an elevator or wipe it clean, put Dettol over it every time you use it. And that's one of the reasons New York has such a high rate of infection in those very tall areas. So what I'm saying is that I think this emblem of the 20th century maybe is just that. It's an emblem of something past. And towers on a podium are still looking backward rather than looking forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Next.
Do you agree? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, no, go for it.
No, I just wondered if you agree, since you're doing this kind of work.
Yes, I mean, we aim for mid-rise, high density, and even though I mentioned podiums, we try and activate the ground floor as much as possible. So I think that there are middle grounds. It's not just a sort of flat podium with lots of towers on top. And there are some very good practices out there aiming for that. Peter Barber's got a very good medium rise high density project in Colindale, which has a supermarket embedded in a podium that's very active all the way around.
Oh, that's good.
And different tenures.
It can be done.
It can be done, yeah.
I think, yeah, I do too. Yeah.
Thanks.
Next up, could we have Lucia Keister Arenda, please?
Hi.
Hello.
Thanks a lot for the talk. I'm calling from nearby in Islington.
Aha.
I was just wondering if you think this is going to see the middle class start to want to leave cities.
No, my fear is just the opposite, that in the name of health, that they'll push the working classes further and further out of cities. I think that the notion of appropriation and expulsion is a more powerful one than suburban flight. Suburban flight means, dad or mom is commuting on that train every day into work. It's much better just, to get rid of all those people in Islington who have council flats and build something that we can live in.
Mm. But I see, for example, you were talking about that we have the luxury of remote working and working from home. And part of the time I live in Lisbon, and I see increasingly that people are actually tempted to leave Lisbon and live in the countryside and work from home out in a beautiful place in nature and still feel connected to the city to access things. But actually I'm wondering whether all the middle class are actually just going to work in their little special villages and separate.
Oh God, that's a dystopia I haven't got to yet, but who knows?
Okay, next up we have Alex Nidabima. Sorry, I've massacred your surname. Are you there, Alex?
Yes, yes, I am.
Hello.
Hey, hi. I'm calling from Kigali, Rwanda.
Ah, amazing. Incredible.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Our contribution of architects, or rather, our contribution as architects is pretty straightforward. We shape how built environments contribute to solving different problems. But I'm curious, as part of your research, what might be the contribution of, post studies following the pandemic to identify how people have improvised or how they have been deprived of everyday experiences, so that informs the new typology of safer, healthier, more social spaces.
Yeah. Well, I think I know Kigali, and it's a different world from London in terms of this, because the resources that you're going to have available post-pandemic are going to be much less than the resources that'll be available in a city like London. That's good and that's bad. If just following on the discussion we just had, the result of this is that the middle class tries to expel the working class from the center of the city. They'll have the money to do that in London in a way that they won't have in Kigali. I just say this to you as a UN worker, not as a professor. I think the issue for us in dealing with emerging cities like yours is how to make use of informal settlements, how to organize them better, because we don't have a lot of resources, how to create safety zones, for instance, in times of the pandemic, and then how those zones can be controlled by the community rather than by central powers. So to me, a lot of this, when you're resource stressed, I think my own view about this is that community control can do a lot. It's not going to build the kind of prototypical housing I'm talking about. It's expensive at the moment. It may become unexpensive in 20 years, but you'll have to tell me. I won't be around, but maybe your generation will find a way to make it less expensive. But in the meantime, I think the real key to squaring this puzzle between green and healthy lies in local control of space, public space, and since the resources to build are not there.
Right. Yeah, we share similar thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more, and I'm giving the mic to Hani. Are you there, Hani?
Hi, yes. So thanks for the lecture, Richard. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to kind of try and maybe have a little discussion about developing states, given that a large proportion of the world is going to become, well, the world's urban population is going to be made up of developing states that are currently in their stage of development right now. The main question is really about the challenges. So obviously dealing with pandemics is a challenge, but also dealing with climate change and the kind of extreme weather events that are happening more frequently is going to be an issue. So I was wondering how you think that urban landscapes will begin to kind of diverge from what we already have within these developed countries, like in kind of London, particular example of London, or even New York and some of the gridded cities, and kind of links to the question that was previously asked as well about how you think that the role of architects and even policymakers can kind of influence.
Well, the thing that most concerns me from a climate point of view about developing cities is the issue of water, because and in a double way. One, obviously, that is within the city, that, you know, access to clean water is that's the kind of very baseline for having both a healthy city and also an economically productive city. And climate change is in cities like Sao Paulo is having an effect on the water table within cities. But the more urgent thing to me is this: we're seeing, because of climate change, a massive desertification of the places like the Sahel, which formerly could support people to farm or to be productive in villages. Mm-hmm. And this massive desertification sets up climate refugees who are leaving places like the Sahel, which is a huge semi-desert and desert, and where they go is cities. By the way, you can hear outside people clapping for the NHS. Isn't that nice? It's a wonderful sound. But the thing we're trying to understand is how we can deal with, we estimate, I mentioned the Sahel because that's a place part of my team is working on. We estimate that there are going to be about 65 million climate refugees by 2060 from the Sahel because of desertification, and that at least a third of them will head to Europe. That's 20 million refugees. Europe had a convulsion in 2015 when 1.5 million refugees arrived from the Middle East. Multiply that by 20, and the political effects, right-wing political effects, could be horrific. So our notion is that how can, by dealing with desertification, we deal with a kind of urban refugee problem that otherwise could be absolutely devastating, both for the refugees and for the places that they're trying to get to. So that's, this is a very partial answer to your question, but it's why we're in focusing on the urban, which we do, we also have to focus on the rural because of this absolutely terrifying prospect that climate change has in store for us. This is a very down note to end on.
Sorry.
Sorry about that.
But Richard, thank you very, very much. Just two things I need to tell you all. First of all, the program for next week is now, you can find it all on the Architecture Foundation website. We still have a contribution tonight from Jane Rendell over on Instagram Live, but coming up next week, we have Irene Scalbert, Tom Dykhoff's going to be reading The Resolve Collective, involved James Sohn from Project Orange is talking about becoming an architect in the age of climate emergency. Hanif Kara and Jennifer Bonner have a couple of events with their unit from Harvard University Graduate School of Design about mass timber, and on and on. Joe Henry from the GLA and NP2F from Paris will be talking on Friday. I also need to say that we're very much open for proposals for things that you might like to do later in the program. If you've got thoughts, please pitch them. We're kind of chock-a-block, I'd say, up for about the next 5 weeks, but we'd very much like any ideas about other things we can do. My email address is ellis@architecturefoundation.org.uk. But it just leaves me to see if I can find the unmute all button again. And for us all to thank Richard for the presentational talk.
Nothing. We're clapping.
Thank
you very much.
I hope to see you next week.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.